welcome to More Orthodoxy. This is a channel dedicated to Catholics, Orthodox and Protestants alike. Today I'm joined by Frederica Mathewes-Green. Frederica is an American author and speaker known around the world for her excellent work on topics related to Eastern Orthodox belief and practice. Just first of all, Frederica, could you tell us please a bit about your background and some of the key events and movements in your life that have helped form who you are?
Sure, I'm very glad to be able to be speaking to your audience today. And I guess it's, you may not be too familiar with American history, but I grew up in the city in Charleston, South Carolina, where the Confederate War began, the Civil War began. So it was a very historic city and beautiful, beautiful place. That was a wonderful thing about it. And then went to seminary, went to Episcopal seminary, and ended up with my husband, who had been an Episcopal priest. He converted to the Orthodox Church, 1993, however, 20-something years ago. And so we had a very fruitful time with me writing a lot of books about Orthodoxy, as well as books about women's interests and about feminism and things like that. So what a blessing it has been. I counted up, I think I've given like 800 speaking events and been interviewed by the media like 600 times or something, and written another 600 essays in addition to 10 books. So I always say, no wonder I'm tired. It's been a lot.
We're all very grateful for that anyway. So what first drew you both to Orthodoxy specifically then?
Oh yes. Well, we had been in the Episcopal Church in America, which is the Anglican Church for those in the UK. And we were towards the end of the 80s becoming more and more concerned about bishops that were saying that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, saying that he was not born of a virgin. It was mostly theological at that stage. A couple of decades later, I think Anglicans, Episcopalians are wrestling even more with moral issues and sexuality issues. But our time back in the 80s, it really was all this stuff about, if you think Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then why get out of bed on Sunday morning? Why bother to go to church? Why do any of this? Watch a movie, take it easy. So that threat made us think, well, we had kids and we thought, what if our kids grow up and then they stay Episcopalian and they move away and they join a church where they lose their faith? So that was what had us really worried. And my husband went to an Episcopal church, an Orthodox church, just for a Vesper service. And he totally fell in love with it. It was like right away. He came home saying, I have to be Orthodox. This is the true church. It was so beautiful. I've got to do this. And so the next Saturday, I went with him. And I didn't like it at all. I thought it was weird and boring and foreign, and I was sort of evangelical then. So I thought, and these people are not even worshiping. I was looking around the church and just judging people, because to me then, worshiping is when you're smiling and singing. and they were all like standing still and looking very thoughtful. So I said, well, they're not worshiping. So it took me a little longer. And in fact, I found that to be a pattern, that when there's a couple that are interested in Orthodoxy and exploring it, a priest told me when a couple comes to him, if one of them wants to be chrismated and the other doesn't, 80% of the time, it's the husband who would like to be Orthodox, and it's the wife who takes longer coming along. I think that's because as an evangelical, I was used to kind of being coddled in my faith, that the faith was not so much on Jesus, it was on me. The focus of how Jesus loves me, Jesus takes care of me, Jesus forgives me, Jesus is just focused on me 24 hours a day. And that's pleasant, I think maybe it's harder for women than men. Church where the, more orthodoxy, as you say, that the faith is really the focus. God is the focus. The theology has to be the real theology of the early church. I came around to that, but I held him back a couple of years.
So then, either before or after your conversion, are there any particular persons that stand out as especially inspirational or influential for you?
About Orthodoxy or about my Christian faith just in general?
I suppose both, if you want to take
Uh,
them separately.
yeah, I guess I ought to tell this story if people don't know it because it's so central to everything about me. Which was as a child we lived in a nominal Catholic household, but we didn't say prayers at home at all. We didn't say grace over meals or anything. We just kept going to church every Sunday because you have to go to church on Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got into my teens, I lost my faith and I totally rejected Christian faith and became really quite hostile and cynical about it. And I felt angry, like I had been tricked into believing something that was inherently stupid, that the whole concept that God could become human, that God could rise from the dead, it would just seem stupid to me. And I felt like I had been tricked into this and I'd made a fool of myself. I find that it tends to be ex-Catholics more than ex-Protestants have that strain of bitterness and cynicism. You don't find an ex-Baptist who's profoundly bitter, but you find plenty of Catholics that way. So that was me. When I was dating my husband and as we were getting closer to our wedding, I was still fundamentally anti-Christian, and he was an atheist. He really had no interest in spirituality. I was a seeker, but he didn't really care about it.
Mm-hmm.
But he was required to read one of the Gospels as one of his college courses, and he picked Mark because it was the shortest.
Mm-hmm.
And as he was reading it, it began to have a profound effect on him. And he started saying, "There's something about Jesus. There's just something about him. It's like he speaks with authority," which of course is what it says in Mark over and over again. He speaks with authority. He said, Jesus tells the truth. And if Jesus believes that there's a God, I'm going to have to rethink my atheism. And I put on the brakes and I said, no, this is terrible. You're not going to become one of those stupid Christians, are you? I was very opposed to it. So we had our hippie wedding out in the woods. I read a Hindu prayer as part of our wedding service. And then we flew to Europe. Thank God, it was wonderful. We had saved enough money that we could hitchhike around Europe for a few months. So it was June 20th, 1974. So that's almost exactly 47 years ago, if I remember my math at all. And we just arrived in Dublin, actually. Mm-hmm. And we hitchhiked, from the port to the city center, and found a bed and breakfast, put down our backpacks, went out to walk around. And one of the places that was open we went into was the church, a Catholic church called the Pro Cathedral in Dublin. Perhaps you're familiar with it. Mm-hmm. So we walked in, and there wasn't a service going on. It was just open to people that wanted to come in. I was attracted to an altar far in the back right of the church, where there was a statue of Jesus. It was the presentation that Catholics call the Sacred Heart. So it was white marble, and he was standing there gesturing to his heart that had thorns wrapped around it. He appeared to a Belgian nun and said, "Behold the heart that has so loved mankind." And while I was looking at it, I realized that I had fallen to my knees, and I could hear a voice speaking to me. It wasn't a voice that I heard with my ears. It was an interior voice, but it had so much authority. It was the realest thing that had ever happened to me in my life. Sometimes with spiritual experiences, people are like, "I don't know if it really happened." This really happened. It was like a brick to the side of the head. And what the voice said was, "I am your life." You think that your life is your name and your history and your personality, but that is not your life. I am your life. Beyond that, you think your life is just the fact that your heart beats and you're alive, but even that is not your life. I am your life. I am the foundation of everything else in your life. And so I stood up. I felt scared. I felt shaky. I didn't know what had happened to me. And I was so kind of knocked off, my block by it, that I didn't even tell my husband for a whole week. And by that point, we're down in the south of Ireland, hitchhiking back up to Dublin again. And as we were standing by the side of the road in the early morning, I kind of stumbled and blurted it out, And his response was, "It'll pass." So that's 47 years later, considering he's been a pastor all this time. Our son is a pastor, another son is a subdeacon, a grandson is in seminary. I've written all these books. It didn't pass. It just put down roots and got broader and deeper and more wonderful.
Yeah.
And that initial love for Jesus, it was like I was caught on a hook. I just still have so much craving to know him, to hear his voice, to see him. I always want more of Jesus. So I found my evangelical faith fed that in many ways. I have found it fed in a more mature way. I hope that's not insulting. In Orthodoxy, a way that is not as focused on me. I thought the problem is me, so let's all focus on me. But I found out that you can focus on Christ and entirely different things happen. So that's kind of my short story about how I got here.
Wonderful.
I began being a writer as I was vice president of a group called Feminists for Life. It was a secular pro-life organization for feminists that believed abortion was wrong and that abortion was harming to women. So I began my career as a writer and speaker with that issue. It was about 3 years later that we became Orthodox. So my initial work was all in the pro-life cause. From then on, the great majority has had to do with Orthodoxy.
Just regarding that early work then, you've written the book Real Choices, Listening to Women Looking for Alternatives to Abortion. I was wondering what moved you then to release that book, and why is it so important to listen to such stories and hear people's testaments and so forth?
Sure, yeah. And I have a stack here of all my books, so I can do this. And the first one was called Real Choices. Subtitle is Listening to Women Looking for Alternatives to Abortion. And that was my goal. I was blessed that being a vice president of Feminists for Life, I was able to go to regular meetings with all the other pro-life leaders. The presidents or CEOs of all the big pro-life organizations would gather, and we would have regular meetings through the course of the year. Even though my organization was very, very small, I was rubbing elbows with the big ones. And I noticed that a huge amount of work was going into helping pregnant women who were having problem pregnancies, who needed support. Maybe they needed a place to live. Maybe they needed medical care. They were doing everything they could to meet those needs so that women would have a choice other than abortion. Because so often after an abortion, a woman says, I really didn't have a choice. So Real Choices was the concept. And I decided to interview women who had had abortions and people running pregnancy care centers and ask each of them, what is it the women need? With the post-abortion women, I asked, was there anything anyone could have done that would have helped you to continue that pregnancy? And the surprise was, I expected they would say, I needed a place to live, I needed medical care. I thought it would be all those practical things. Some of them even said to me, I knew where to get those things. I knew that was available. What I needed was somebody to stand by me, because everybody in my life was telling me to have the abortion. One woman said, everybody was saying, I'll be there for you if you have the abortion, but nobody said, I'll be there for you if you have the baby. So I interviewed 40, 50 women all over the country and wrote down their stories of the decision-making steps, how they ended up in that abortion clinic. It was distressing to hear from time to time women say that they really didn't want the abortion, but it was the boyfriend or the husband that was pressuring them to do that. As I added it up later, about 88% of the time, the ultimate reason for the abortion was pressure from another person, most of the time the father of the child. Twice I had women tell me, I was lying there on the table for the procedure to begin, and I was praying that my boyfriend would burst in the door and say, "Stop, I changed my mind." So it really wasn't the woman's choice a lot of times. So that was the reason I wrote Real Choices, was to get this discussion going. And I have to say, thank God, it's been very, very influential with the pregnancy care movement in America. It's often used for training volunteers who will interview and counsel with pregnant women. So I feel like it did a good work. I'm glad for it.
Wonderful, thank God. Do you think the problems women face now then related to abortion and those pressures, do you think they've changed much over the years, or are they the same now as they were then?
I think some things are just part of the human predicament, and they will never change. I think the pressure that boyfriends can put on girlfriends, it probably has not changed. I think one thing that has changed, though, is that unwed pregnancy and single parenting is much more acceptable than it was 20-something years ago. And I'm not sure that's a good thing. I feel ambivalent about that. I expect that there are many women who didn't have abortions because they weren't ashamed. The women that I interviewed, some of them were, feminist, pro-choice types. Some of them were sheltered Christian girls. But both of them were saying, I was embarrassed for people to find out I was pregnant. I had the abortion to hide the pregnancy. I don't think that happens as often anymore, perhaps because pro-lifers have done such a good job of destigmatizing unwed pregnancy. On the other hand, now we have all this unwed pregnancy and single parenting, and that is not always the best for the child or for the woman. So it's different in that respect, and I think it's a complicated question.
Yeah. So thankfully, this seems to be something that Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox can all come together on, and there's a lot of good inroads being made, I suppose, regarding the pro-life issue. Is there anything distinctly Orthodox, or what does a distinct Orthodox pro-life ethic look like, maybe compared to, say, the Catholic pro-life ethic or Protestant versions, or is there any real distinctions that you'd like to sort of mention?
I think the pro-life ethic is the same everywhere. I think one of the things that Orthodoxy can bring is that we've collected lists of the sayings of the early church fathers saying why abortion was wrong in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, verbalizing it then. When I was in favor of abortion, I thought the child was just a glob of tissue. And that's one of the things St. Basil the Great says, whether the child is formed or unformed at the time of the abortion, we make no distinction. It's still a child. So that's one of the things that we can add to the collection. But I have to say, I think Catholics and Protestants have done much more than Orthodox have. I find that Orthodox, at least in America, a lot of times they came to America not as evangelists. They came here seeking a better life. And often their sense of not really fitting in can last for a couple of generations. And the idea of going out there and getting involved in something political and controversial, it just doesn't occur to them. They still sort of feel like I'm on the outside looking in. And they don't necessarily step right into those roles like Protestants and Catholics do. I hope that will change, but I understand it.
God willing, anyway. So you've also written about another contentious issue about gender, men, women, sex, and feminism. I was wondering what were some of the issues that you thought were the most pressing at the time you wrote that book, and maybe are there some today that remain essential for us as Christians?
Yes, yeah. The book called Gender, um, Gender, it says Men, Women, Sex, Feminism, and it's really an anthology. It's a collection of essays and short articles that I wrote, all on that common theme. At the time, thought we would do a series of anthologies. Like one would just be humor. One would be about the pro-life cause. They would just have different topics. And I don't know if people know this commonly, but anthologies just don't sell very well, even with a very popular author. So we wrote out the first one and said, let's not bother with the rest of them. So the common theme, you hear gender today and you think about transgender rights and so forth. The book was written in 2001, and the word did not mean that then. I was just talking about marriage and gender roles and feminism and the damage it's done to male-female relationships. And all of my collected essays with many different directions that fit underneath that umbrella. I don't know what's changed today. Human nature never changes. But I think, of course, the big change just in the last 5 years is that this word gender means something entirely different.
Yeah.
And perhaps I'm a little bit different from my allies because people like to say there's no such thing as gender. It's just a word in linguistics, but it means nothing in reality. The point I've made over and over is that I think we do have gender roles. I think we have, our sex is determined at conception. And so we're either male or female. Very, very rarely somebody has an intersex condition, extremely rarely. But most of us were born one or the other. But I do believe that cultures have a whole array of elaborations and exaggerations that they like to put on the sex of either male or female because it makes them happy. Because the difference between men and women is a good thing. It's a joyous thing. It's where babies come from. It's like the best thing. And it's, as such, it is one of the most necessary and profound occupations that the human race has, which is reproducing itself. So we do have things like men and women dress differently, and men wear jackets that have real broad shoulders, and women try to make it look like they have a waistline even when they don't. So it's like we all know what the goal is, and we try to imitate that. I know as feminists, we thought, oh, that's terrible, it's so oppressive. But as a Christian, I think it's really delightful. I like it that we have different gender roles. I think it's a fun and a funny thing. So when I use the word gender, that's what I meant, that I didn't want to agree with conservatives who are saying there's no such thing as gender. I think there are gender roles, and I'm very much in favor of them.
And then regarding yourself as an Orthodox woman writing about these issues, what are some of the key differences between our anthropology and notions of sexuality and gender versus maybe common secularist definitions of, say, the human person about males and females, feminine, masculine, and so on?
Is there anything specific? I'm sorry, it froze for a second. I think I missed a word. You were asking me if there's anything specifically Orthodox, an Orthodox take on that, on the differences between men and women. This is something I've had a lot of trouble putting my finger on and putting into words. But there's a way in which Western Christianity, Western everything perhaps, is more verbalized than it is in Orthodoxy. And evidence of that I saw when I was converting and soon after was how often, if a question came up about theology, the Orthodox people would say, well, here's an icon. This is the icon we look at, here's a prayer we say, here's a hymn we sing. They went right to worship. They went directly to worship and prayer rather than to, well, this contemporary theologian says this. I think that because of the Reformation, that in the West, our faith, Christian faith, became much more verbalized and turned into propositions and assertions, and then argued about, which sharpens and sharpens those assertions, and words take on very charged meanings. I think that people look to Orthodoxy and say, okay, what do you have on that? And often we don't. We've just never gotten to that point. In Europe, there was a lot of bickering and fighting and even warring between Protestants and Catholics. In the East, Christians did not fight against Christians. There wasn't a need to define our faith in light of other Christians. We were being killed by Muslims or by communists or by someone else, but it didn't sharpen the ability to talk about our theology in an assertional, propositional way, like has been done in the West. It's very hard to get that across, because you expect that we've got that whole list of things we can bring right out, and we don't. It's like we're at a different stage of that process.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that comes across kind of maybe implicitly in your own work. For example, whenever you write in Welcome to the Orthodox Church about marriage, and when other Orthodox theologians and people write about marriage, they will show how comprehensive and sacramental it is, and how that differentiates obviously from secularism, and also from Catholic and Protestant understandings about marriage, and then obviously that entails so much more. I was wondering if you just briefly tell us about Orthodox marriage and how it's distinct, if that's possible.
Yes, the Orthodox wedding service is distinct. It's not like anything in the West, where I think Catholic and Protestant wedding services are kind of growing out of the same stalk. They have some resemblance there. And I was watching an old movie from the 40s, and they just started right out with the Anglican prayer book, going through the prayers there. It was familiar enough to the culture that everybody knew right away what he was going to say next. In Orthodoxy, it's a totally different service, and it often begins with the exchange of rings, that the couple comes into the church, and the priest meets them at the back of the church, and there's a ceremony where he touches the ring to the forehead of one and the forehead of the other, and then it goes on the finger, and vice versa with the other partner. And at that point, before they go into this, a priest asks, "Are you here of your own free will? And have you promised to marry anyone else?" So they have those two questions that they can answer before they get into the wedding itself. And that is the only time that the couple speak in the whole service. Everything else is prayers said over them. They don't say anything. They don't make any vows. They just say, "I'm here of my own accord. I'm not engaged to anyone else." And that's it. So everything kind of happens to them. After they receive the rings, they come forward, but not all the way to the altar. A table is set up in the nave of the church. And from that point, there are prayers over them. There are crowns that are placed on their heads. In the Greek tradition, this is just like a wreath, kind of. It's a circle of leaves and flowers. In the Russian tradition, where you couldn't necessarily get your hands on materials like that in the winter, instead they have kind of imperial looking crowns, fancy golden crowns that are really too heavy to wear. So their sponsor has to stand behind them and hold it up. That's probably another thing, is that just like you have a godmother, or godfather when you're baptized, in a wedding, you have a sponsor. And this is a couple, an Orthodox married couple, that promises to pray for you. They'll be available if you need some advice or counseling. So you have kind of a buddy as you go into this. And the most distinctive moment of the service is the placing of those crowns on the heads, again with prayers and touching it to one forehead and then the other. And then the priest and the couple go around the table 3 times, chanting the song of Isaiah, "Rejoice, Isaiah, dance for joy." So it's and you have no choice about what scriptures you're going to hear. You're going to hear the wedding at Cana, but the passage is Ephesians 5, which says that women should be subject to their husbands. Men should give themselves for their wives, as Christ gave himself. you even suffering to death on her behalf. The wife is not asked to die for her husband. It's vice versa. But the wife is supposed to, the two are submitted to one another, but there's a dance sort of in which the wife is submitted to the husband.
Yeah.
As I was very, very opposed to wifely submission when I first heard of it. And then I started looking at the couples I knew who believed in it, and I saw that it didn't believe what I thought. It always was, in the marriages that I saw, the men and the women had equal responsibility, and it would only become the husband's opportunity to make a decision over the head of the wife if they were really locked in conflict. And in that condition, she was supposed to adhere to his decision, which is kind of what I did when I became Orthodox. I still didn't really like it. I didn't get it. But he loved it so much. I said, okay, I'll go with you. And then obviously I came to love it very much.
I think another distinction that you bring out in back in the Orthodox Church too is how marriage is understood as eternal, whereas in the West we read, say, Jesus' response to the Sadducees and assume whenever he said about there was no marriage or whatever in the kingdom, we misread that. Can you maybe tell us about why that's a misreading and how we understand marriage as eternal and sacramental?
Yes, yeah, that's a good thing. I'm surprised how often people bring up that passage where the Sadducees are trying to trick Jesus by saying it was a woman whose husband died, and under the Levirate system, she then had to be married to each of the man's brothers, 7 brothers in all, and then she died last of all. And so they think this is a trick question, and they say, so who will be her husband in the resurrection? Because they don't believe in resurrection at all. So it's just trying to make him look stupid. And the obvious answer, whose will she be, is the first. You know, that was the marriage, the wedding that she entered into. And the others were just subsequent kind of social arrangements that were necessary so that she could have children that would support her for the rest of her life. But the real wedding was the first. So there's an obvious answer, but Jesus doesn't say that. He says, in the kingdom of heaven, there's not going to be any marrying or any giving in marriage, but they will be like the angels. So he's saying there's not going to be wedding ceremonies. Nobody's going to get married in heaven. There's not going to be marrying. But our union with each other is eternal. And that's something we've seen throughout the history of the church. We have always believed that marriage is something eternal. And St. John Chrysostom has a beautiful passage where he's speaking to a young widow who was married only 5 years. And he says, don't grieve, because you will see him again. And you will see him not just for 5 years like you did on earth. You will be with him not just for 10 years or twice that or 1,000 years or 5 times that number, but for endless ages and ages, the two of you will be together. So that is the belief of the Orthodox Christians, which of course we share with Catholics and many Protestants as well, I hope.
Beautiful. So also you have written The Open Door, Entering the Sanctuary of Icons and Prayer. So obviously icons, as we mentioned before, are central to the church. For non-Orthodox, they'll not know what an iconostasis is, for example, and why it takes such pride of place in the church. Can you tell us a bit about icons of the iconostasis, and then maybe some of the icons of feasts and saints and so forth, and why they matter for us?
Yes, that would be fine. I find that the 2 things that Protestants are most antsy about in Orthodoxy are the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos, and icons. And they really do think of icons as being a kind of idolatry. So I wrote my little book, The Open Door, about icons, and it's set up on the idea that we're going to church together. I start out by saying, come into this church with me. I want to show you these icons. And so we go, every chapter we go visit a different icon and learn the story about them.
Mm-hmm.
So the iconostasis is I was going to say it's a wall, but in some churches, it's really more like an open fence that just has icons attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
In a Russian church, it may be really a wall and go up for 3, levels and go up 30 feet or something. So the variation is there. It began with there being a low rail, like a communion rail in the earliest churches. And when they began using icons, they would attach icons to the communion rail. And in time, it just grew. And there became a real a pattern or an order for where the icons would be. That if you come into an Orthodox church, no matter where it is, you will see on the right of the central door, there's an icon of Christ. On the left, there's an icon of Mary. And that's because the Psalm says, the Virgin stands at your right, the Queen stands at your right hand. So she is on Christ's right as she's on our left there. And on the other side of them, there's often deacons, that might be John the Baptist on one side, angels, guardian angels, or Michael and Gabriel on the doors, that open behind into the altar. So it bothered me at first because I thought, why are we hiding the altar? What's wrong with seeing the altar? We should feel free to approach the altar. I had a lot of these phrases in my mind. Mm-hmm. And I can see how it just kind of grew. It started out as a way of holding up icons for people to look at, and then grew sometimes in Russian churches very high, as I said. But it's a very, very ancient custom. And I would encourage listeners, viewers, to look this up later. The name of a little village that was between the edge of the Roman Empire and the edge of the Persian Empire that's now in Syria. The name of it is Dura Europos, D-U-R-A dash E-U-R-O-P-O-S. I think it's O-S, might be U-S. Mm-hmm. Dura Europos was a little Roman village, a garrison town, a military town. And in the year 256, the Persians attacked and they won the town. They went just right over the town. They conquered everybody. They killed everybody. They took them away as slaves. They did whatever they did with them. But they abandoned the city after they conquered it. They just walked away. And so sands began to build up over it, over and over and over, until it was totally covered with sand. And it was about 1920 that it was rediscovered. So all this time, it's been totally untouched. What's interesting to Christians is that right on one side, next to the city wall, on one side of the military garrison, there's a church. There's a Christian church. And on the other side, a little bit further down, there's a synagogue. And the soldiers filled them up with rubble and all kinds of stuff so that they couldn't break through the wall. So it was covered, it was full of rubble and then covered with sand. So they were perfectly preserved. It is the earliest church that we can see that's ever been found. The notable thing is that the walls are covered with icons. Even at that early date, 256, Christians were painting the interior walls of their worship space with images from scripture, scenes from scripture. It's really a beautiful thing to see. The extremely curious thing is that the synagogue is also covered with images. Mm-hmm. You think that, the Jews forbid the use of icons or images, and yet inside the synagogue, it's all Old Testament scenes, mm-hmm. but it's actually better art than the Christian church. The church, it looks kind of amateurish. The synagogue, the images are really very well painted.
I think also from a more kind of modern perspective, as it were, I think the fact that we are liturgical beings, as Father Schmemann, for example, would say, that, or homo viviens, or whatever the term is he uses, that we're constantly bombarded with images, a kind of secular icons, as it were, idols, more like, in the media, and it sort of ritually trains us to perceive the good lifestyle through advertising and things like that. Do you think that our kind of liturgical repetitions and going in line with the church's rhythms saves us from being misdirected and having our kind of natural or supernatural, whichever way you want to look at it, inclinations directed towards the actual proper order, as it were? Or does that make sense?
Yes, yes. I think that's the point. That's the purpose of icons, is to reorient us visually to reality and to that which is profound, which what we're seeing on our screens often is very superficial. And it's designed just to, reel us in like they're fishing. They want to expose us to advertising.
Yeah.
So what they use to attract us really doesn't matter. It's just getting our eyeballs on the advertising. This is so difficult now. I have 14 grandchildren, and every parent I know that I'm related to is struggling with the issue of screens. It appears that children will spend as much time as they can on their screens. They become addicted to it. And this is hard for those of us who want to teach them to honor images of our Lord and his mother, because the images on the screens are funny, it's musical, they're moving around. And it's all focus grouped and written by psychologists to make it as addictive as possible. So parents are up against a formidable foe that is determined to capture the minds of our children. I live near one of my sons and his 3 kids, and I know it's a daily battle for them to now during the Corona time, they're allowing the kids 2 hours a day at their screens, but they cannot access the internet. They will decide ahead of time, we're going to watch this movie, only this movie. They have no access to the internet without their parents standing over his shoulder. I think that's necessary these days. And even still, they've got to, turn off the screen and do something else most of the day, and have prayer time in their icon corner at night. We try to rebalance that. I often think how different it was in the first centuries, where when you went to church on Sunday, you were going to see vestments and smell incense, and the clergy are moving around the church and they're swinging the incense, the bells are chiming. There's just so much going on. It's like an immersion experience where you are surrounded by lights and beauty and color, smells. You touch and kiss the edge of the priest's garment as he goes by. Every one of your senses is just being tantalized, and the music is extraordinary. So in those days, that would be the most impressive thing you experienced all week. That would be the most beautiful thing you saw all week. It would be the best singing you heard. It would be the most beautiful sights that you saw. And because we're setting the prayers to music and we're singing everything 3 times, it's going to keep going through your head, and it's very instructional. It teaches so much theology. It's going to keep coming to mind, why Jesus went to see Lazarus, why he raised him. You've got these songs stuck in your head now. What a difference now that we have them for maybe an hour and a half. And the whole rest of the week, they're just glued to their screens. So this is a serious and even malicious influence that we're trying to combat. Icons do specifically try to combat that, but it's very difficult.
So just back to the early church then. I'd love to discuss all of your books, but I don't want to keep you all day. So I just wanted to look at 1 or 2 others, if that's okay. Because you have written Mary as the early Christians knew her, the mother of Jesus, in 3 ancient texts. I was wondering, how did the first Christians view Mary, and how did Mary, the mother of Jesus, become the Theotokos?
Sure. Well, let's see. Here it is. Mary, as the early Christians knew her, the mother of Jesus, in 3 ancient texts. How this book came about was, it was the mid-2000s, and there was all that talk about lost gospels. and all finding these ancient texts and proving this or proving that. And I thought, well, that's stupid, because we Christians have a lot of other ancient texts. It's not only the New Testament. There's, I think I've got, 100 volumes here in my office of writings from the early church. There was far too much to put in the New Testament. They just picked the very best, but there's endless amounts. So I wanted to take a few of the very early documents about Mary to show my Protestant friends, something my Catholic friends already know, to show my Protestant friends how they saw her. And the three texts are, first of all, one that it's a delightful document because it's so clearly something that was told by word of mouth. It's not written. Nobody sat down and wrote this. It's a story. It's a campfire tale, It's a story people passed around, and it's about Mary. It's like, after people came to know Jesus and they loved him, they had so many questions. And one of the things they want to know is the prequel. You know how a movie, you have the prequel? They want to know the prequel about Jesus, like, well, where did his mother come from? And who was she related to? And what was her life like? And so this is the prequel. And unfortunately, the name for it is kind of hard to spell. Scholars call it the proto-evangelion. Like proto, evangelion like gospel. So it's the proto-evangelion of James, because it claims to be written by James, the brother of the Lord, who wrote the Epistle of James. I don't think it was. He says, I wrote this in 4 AD. I just don't think anybody wrote this story in 4 AD. But it's just such a charming, it's an excited story. It's headlong. It's all kinds of amazing things are happening. And you can just see the storyteller acting it out and being shocked, and then being angry. And I love this story, the Proto-Evangelion. So what I did was I made a new translation of it. And I've got my translation on one side. On the other side, I go through verse by verse, and I supply all the scriptures it's referring to, or I explain customs that might not be familiar. So that's the first of the three texts. Scholars say from about 150. I ended up thinking, I bet it's first century. I bet it's before the year 100. That's my guess. And two other texts. One is a very long and very beautiful hymn that Orthodox love. It's called the Akathist to the Theotokos. That one as well, I made a translation, wrote annotations. The one in the middle is interesting because it's the earliest prayer to the Virgin Mary. It was found on a little piece of parchment about the size of a 3x5 card that was found in Egypt about the turn of the last century. And the thing that's so startling about it is that it addresses the Theotokos. That is, it's a prayer to her. You might ask, well, when did they start praying to Mary? And this is a prayer addressed to her from about the year 250. It's a short little prayer. It's one Catholics and Orthodox still use in some of our services. So I explore that as well. I see this process where early on, it's the prequel, it's an exciting story. They love Mary. They love her so much right from the start. They just are hanging on every single thing that happens to her. And then the second one is now we're beginning to pray to Mary. And then the third one, the Akathist hymn, is all of this theology about her has been elaborated. All the connections to the Old Testament, all the poetic, all the puns, everything. It's just so elaborate at this point. It's like a beautiful church. So that's another one that was fun to go through verse by verse and explore the various meanings and resonances with Scripture.
Oh, wonderful.
So Mary, the mother of Jesus, and three ancient texts.
Excellent. Frederica. So you've also done a beautiful book about the Jesus Prayer, which is becoming increasingly popular amongst non-Orthodox as well. The ancient desert prayer that tunes the heart to God. I was wondering, for those who maybe don't know, what's the Jesus Prayer, and how does this prayer provide a doorway into a real and deepening sense of Christ's continuing presence in our lives.
Yes, yes. Ever since my conversion, that was my hunger, to connect with that voice that spoke to me, that presence that was so palpable at that moment. And I was so pleased when I learned about the Jesus prayer and that it works. You know, we don't say this about prayers very often, but it actually works. I could do like a commercial for detergent or something. Try it right here in this book. It works, I guarantee. This is the Jesus prayer. uh, what the early Christians discovered was that they wanted to maintain that constant presence of God. St. Paul says in 4 different letters that we should pray constantly, that we should always be in prayer. And so how do you do that? And for most of us, you think, well, I'm going to try it, and then I'm going to pray every minute. And you can't, you know, you end up doing other things and thinking about other things. So why would he say it that much and that emphatically if it wasn't possible to do? So starting in the 2nd century through about the 5th century, 6th century, men and women in Egypt and Palestine started going out into the desert to focus on nothing but prayer. It was going to just be praying all the time. They quickly realized that the reason that's hard is because you get distracted. You have other thoughts. And so we can't stay focused all the time on our connection with the Lord. We're always just flying away after one thought or another. So what you need, they figured, is an alternative thought. Kind of like in the game tag. I assume you play tag in the UK.
Yeah.
Yeah, you pace around and around, and you're trying to catch everybody. But if they get to home base, they can grab onto the tree or whatever it is, and then they're safe. They're at home base.
Yeah.
So they decided you need a little short prayer that will be like home base. That as the thoughts come, they try to get you stuck to them. Like, oh, I have to solve this problem. Oh, I need to plan this. If you recognize what's happening, though, instead of getting stuck, you can say, oh, that's a distracting thought. And I'm going to go to home base. I'm just going to run to home base. And then the first few hundred years, they tried a lot of different script, like just what's your favorite scripture? Use that for your home base. Just very short prayers like, help me, Jesus. They ended up with, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. They're shorter, longer versions, but the core of it is there. You're speaking to Jesus and you're asking for mercy. Mm-hmm. It bothered me at first because I was such a Protestant, and I thought, he's already forgiven our sins. Why do we have to keep begging for mercy? But I realized it's not like mercy in a courtroom. It's like all the people that when he was coming, they would cry out to him and say, Jesus, have mercy on me. The blind man, or the 10 lepers, or the publican in the temple saying, you know, God have mercy on me, a sinner. The people asking for mercy are ones who know that they are needy and that Jesus has what they need and that he can help them. It's a request for him to come to you and to help you. It's not about, am I saved or not? So that's the core of it. We pray, Lord Jesus Christ, and then we say, have mercy on me. Have mercy on me, a sinner, is the way I pray it. My confessor told me that I needed to add that about being a sinner. So I thought, well, he would know, I suppose. So it's such a short prayer, and I've got a whole book about it, but I try to do the history and how it arrived, how it got to this particular formulation. And then about half the book is just question and answer. Questions people ask me about how exactly do I do this? What is a prayer rope? How do you use a prayer rope? How long should I say it? What do I do about distractions? There's a saying that the birds are going to fly overhead, but you don't have to let them make a nest in your hair. So that's the core of it. Just stick with the Jesus prayer. When those distracting thoughts come by, recognize them.
Fantastic.
The Jesus prayer helps you build the part of your brain that notices what you are thinking. So it gets easier as you go along.
Wonderful. Thank you, Frederica. So let's do one more, if we may.
Okay.
The book I mentioned before, Welcome to the Orthodox Church, An Introduction to
Oh,
Eastern Christianity. So there are a number of introductory books to Orthodoxy. I think of Metropolitan Callistos Ware's, Father McGuckin's got one that came out there recently, and they're all great. But I think yours is also really refreshing, and you have such a distinct, unique look at the church, and I like how you take us around into the nave of the church and so on. Could you tell us maybe what inspired you to write it and how it is different or distinct from those other introductory texts?
yes, yes. This is my big book, which is called Welcome to the Orthodox Church, and I wrote it because I always say I try to write the books I wish I could have read.
Mm.
You know, back then when I didn't know anything about the Jesus Prayer, whatever. Those are the books that I wish somebody had already written. And when my husband was just getting crazy about Orthodoxy, this is such a great book. We need to read this book. We need to become members of this church. He asked me to read Shmeiman and Metropolitan Callistos, wonderful book, The Orthodox Church, and a lot of other books about history and theology. And I just got bogged down. I was still enough of an evangelical girl that it's like, well, there's nothing in here about me. I don't know what the point of this is. So um, I found that I wasn't able to sustain interest in books of theology and history. But once I became Orthodox and I was thrown in the deep end and I was experiencing it, immersed in it all the time, my heart really awoke to it and I loved it more and more. So I think part of the problem with Orthodoxy in the West is that we are so used to theoretical descriptions and explanations. Really in the East, where there's no other kind of Christianity, everybody gets thrown in the deep end and you just understand it. You just get soaked in it and you're watching the other people around you and you notice how they're worshiping and you listen to them when they're talking and you hear they might joke about this, but they never joke about that. All of those little things. That's how humans are designed to learn, by looking at other people, by being part of a community. So that was the big change I made in my book that, as far as I know, no other book about Orthodoxy is done. I wanted to do it in terms of storytelling. So it's kind of like a work of fiction. I start by taking the reader into this church on a Tuesday afternoon when it's empty. And then I point out everything. Here's the baptismal font. Here's the Iconostasis. Here's this, here's that. This is what you're going to see when we come to worship. And then we start going to worship. And I go through the church year. And I tried to have all the different experiences that an Orthodox convert might be trying to explain to their parents. Like, I want you to come to my wedding, Mom and Dad. It's not going to be what you're used to. Read this chapter here about marriage. Come to the baby's baptism. Read this chapter about baptism. Come to Pascha, which is overwhelming. Starts at 11:30 at night. You go home about 5 in the morning. Read the chapter about Pascha. You'll know what you're in for. So I wrote the whole thing as begins in December, goes through August, and hits many of the main feasts of the church, just trying to throw you in the deep end. It's not every church. You know, that's hard if you're trying to say, well, Orthodox churches have this, that, or the other, but then there's an exception that doesn't. So I stayed with an imaginary church and I could put whatever in that church I wanted to, that I wanted to make a point about. So it's funny and narrative, and it's more like what I wished I could have read way back when.
Well, excellent. I'm glad that you did, because I loved it as well, and I'd already read Metropolitan Callistos' book, and I thought yours was definitely a refreshing perspective, as I say, and it made me things click in my mind that it hadn't clicked before too. So, thanks for that.
And let me say, I am sure there are people, and they would be right, to say this is such a step down in terms of intellectual challenge and profundity. And I think that's true. I think it's partly because of the way our culture makes us babies. And we have, in general, people have been getting stupider over the last few decades, I think. And we're demanding more entertainment. We want things to be funny. And I know that I am serving that. On the other hand, I feel like that's the gospel audience we're trying to reach. That's who we're trying to evangelize now.
Absolutely.
So I do want to speak their language.
Wow.
And I fully agree that Metropolitan Kallistos' book is more profound than mine. I just think kind of tragically, the audience has gotten stupider. I know I've gotten stupider. So we just try to speak that language. I hope without being disrespectful. But yeah, I'm glad with the way that the book has been received. I'm very pleased.
Excellent. And just to close up then, Frederica, is there anything that you're involved with at the moment or that you feel the passion to still complete in the future? Maybe some books or anything else you'd like to tell us about?
Yeah, I'm sure. It's going to sound kind of funny, but I feel like we are headed into an era where Christians are going to be more persecuted. Where Christianity already looked like an embarrassing thing to claim, and it'll be more embarrassing and even completely unacceptable, in particular, if you believe in the biblical standards for sexuality. People are losing their jobs over this, and it's going to get worse. We really have to support each other and strengthen each other in the faith. What I see happening in America is that it's going to be very hard to get into the upper classes. That if you go to college, you are so indoctrinated in the new way of looking at things. And then you want to be a doctor, you finish college, you want to go to medical school, and you realize they will never license you because you believe what the Bible teaches about X, Y, or Z. Yeah. You could spend all this, you could spend this huge amount of money getting an education, and you will never be a doctor, because they will not license you. And that's going to be true of so many professions, more and more. Yeah. I think that Christians will be reduced back to technical work, to the service industry, to being in the lower classes, which maybe isn't so bad. That's where we started. Maybe that's something God is permitting for our own good. I don't know. I often say I'm glad I'm old and I'm not going to have to see this all play out, because I'm basically a coward and I don't know how well I would do. But I think this is what's coming. Yeah. And so I think what we need to do is the time for planning evangelistic strategies that are based on logic, I think that's past. I think our strategy now needs to be telling our story, telling our own personal story, particularly a story about God moving in your life, about a story about a miracle, a story about a time that you felt desolate and then you just felt the Lord come near you and raise your spirits. I think this is where we have to go back to this, and we should be preparing the stories that we have to tell. I think about do you remember in the Old Testament, Naaman, the Syrian, who had leprosy? And it says there was a little girl, like an 8-year-old girl who was Jewish, who had been captured in a raid, taken from her mother and father and made to be a slave to Naaman's wife. But this little girl said, oh, if only Naaman was in my land, my country, because the prophet there would be able to heal him. And so he does go and he bathes in the Jordan River and he is healed. I think we'll be in that position. I often say, imagine it's a Hollywood star in her kitchen one morning weeping over something that has happened to her. And the woman who's wiping down the counters, she'll have her story ready, just like that little girl. And she'll be able to say, there was one time I felt like you did. But this is what happened. This is what God did in my life. There is tremendous hunger for stories like that. There's such hunger for that's proof that the supernatural exists, if nothing else. Great craving in America for ghost stories. I don't know if you have that in the UK. There's TV shows, there's books. Everybody wants to know, is there really a supernatural realm? I believe every Christian has at least one story that they can tell.
Mhm.
And I think we should start getting our stories ready. So that's my book I'm working on. I always tell my conversion story, but I have a lot of other stories. I have so many stories. God has been so good to me.
Excellent.
And so I'm trying to write a book that'll be like an autobiography, but 27, and it'll be in boldface, and it'll have a title, and that will be the next story.
Wonderful.
So you could just flip through and see the God stories. I will call the book Radiance. So if people will pray for me and pray for it, that I'll be able to write Radiance. It was not 2005 when I was praying, and I felt the Lord came to me and said, write this book and let the people see the radiance of Christ in the life of a Christian. So I need help. I need perseverance. I need to actually stick to the job. All your prayers will help me write it. And I will challenge you to think about your story. What's your best story? Think it through, practice it, say your story to somebody that you love and trust. And then I will challenge you to go to somebody that you know is a non-believer. And you can say, there was this lady on TV, and she said I should go to a non-believer and tell the story. And you can say, I'm really embarrassed and I'm nervous, and would it be okay if I told you this story? And you know they're going to say yes. So get in the practice of telling your story. You know, if we have millions of Christians doing that, it's going to make a difference.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Frederica. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and hear your story. And for anybody that is looking to learn more, I'll leave some links in the little description, and then they can learn more about you and your work. And I hope they grow to love it as much as I have. And thanks again.
Thank you so much, Mark. I enjoyed being with you today.